Dr. John Crozier from Australia. He's a vascular and trauma surgeon at the Liverpool Hospital in southwest Sydney. He chaired the Binational Trauma Committee of the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons from 2014. He serves as a vascular surgical specialty representative to RACS. He's a Brigadier Director General of the Australian Defence Health Services Army Reserve, co-chair of the National Alliance for Action on Alcohol, and co-chair an inquiry into Australian National Road Safety Strategy from 2011 to 2020. Professor John Crozier, please.
Good evening, and thank you so much. From the outset, I want to acknowledge what a privilege it is to have been participant in this very special memento to a very special man, Vijayan, whom I was privileged to have known from 2003, my first visit to Tan Tock Seng Hospital. I acknowledge the invitation by Dr. Rolando de la Cruz and Professor Chiengmai Turk. I'd also acknowledge that in Australasia, Southern Asia, I sit in the lands of the Gadigal, the original custodians of this land, and I pay my acknowledgements to their elders past and present. It's a privilege to be participant in this group committed to trauma care and asked to comment on Professor Ian Civill's magisterial presentation. I'm greatly humbled to sit at the feet of giants like Ian and Vijayan. I'd say also, as I looked at Ian's background, how similar it is to the bookshelf of Professor Bill Blaisdell that I'd visited in Sacramento in 1992. A giant of trauma back in the 80s and 90s, the similar backdrop to Ian's presentation. And Ian talking on the nuts and bolts of trauma, and particularly from the perspective of a trauma training program, encapsulated the four elements in Vijayan that I think are common to so many of these giants, Ian himself. Ian talked about the surgeon, the scholar, the educator, and the gentleman. And all of those four descriptors, I think, are apt descriptors of the quintessential trauma exponent. Ian's presentation made reference to the history of trauma fellowships from the early 80s and through to the current in Australia and New Zealand in 2021. We've just established now a trauma fellowship in Australia. He highlighted the need for continuous learning. And one of his photographs showed that passage of the torch of trauma training from Dr. Schwab to Ian, then a fellow. And Ian highlighted too the relevance of education, but particularly the commitment to writing that experience, and the then junior Dr. Rotondo's contribution in a written way to an understanding of compartment syndrome and damage control. And again, that's the challenge for all of us, those in early phases of trauma, but as we progress, that commitment to passing the torch of knowledge, particularly in a written form. Ian made reference to those that have come through as fellows. And we see the seeds of that fellowship and training in trauma blossom in pillars of trauma leadership. A number who don't continue that passionate commitment to trauma do benefit the communities and are imbued with the spirit of what they've seen by the trauma educators, the trauma leaders with whom they have worked. I'll close now just making a few statements, if I could, in relation to Vijayan. And if I could just share screen. Just from the outset, acknowledge the privilege of hearing the personal witness of Vijayan, reiterate what a privilege it has been to know of Vijayan, to acknowledge the presentations by his daughter and wife, And what a great privilege it is to hear those additional descriptions of his life and his too tragic and early death. As I say, I'd met him for the first time in 2003. I knew then of his passionate commitment to education, was impressed with the lifelong commitment in service to his fellow communities wherever they were. The Naval Diving Unit in 1982, his terminal rank as a Lieutenant Colonel, and then transition mid-career in 1996 to surgery. He vitally engaged with students, and it was a privilege to see very senior students all the way through to senior clinicians innovated by his passionate commitment. This is a wonderful photograph that we've seen already and highlights that he would often deferentially put others in the limelight. He's the glue that holds an engaged group together. His good humour, intellect, passionate commitment and engagement with each of an individual brings the work of the group to a much greater whole than would be the case of the best of them as individuals. We've heard already his default position, his innate skills, and as with Professor Jarmin Turk, an accomplished classical pianist, Vijayan was also a very accomplished Hindustani classical musician on the tabla. The smaller of the two drums, the dayan, articulates treble and tonal sounds, and the larger drum, the baya, produces the bass. Vijayan was very much a fan of the former, loved the treble and the tonal, but passionately committed to the bass to keep the tone, the tempo and the tenor of the group moving. I think it's fitting also to see the way his eyes are staring. Now, I was privileged in my final meeting with him to enjoy a walk around the Marina Bay Sands Garden Park with he and his wife. In the multiple trips to Tan Tock Seng, Vijayan had become aware that I had an interest in astronomy, and he produced a photograph on his mobile phone that afternoon as we enjoyed some teh tarik. We see here the stars of the Southern Cross, these two, the pointers, and this through the haze of the constant polluted sky over Singapore. Unfortunately, it sees Singapore the most light polluted country in the world. But Vijayan could see through the pollution. He knew the beauty that existed beyond and obscured often in the night sky of Singapore. And in his mind, he knew that the beauty of the Southern Cross, freed of the pollution, with the pointers here, reveals beauties like this globular cluster known as the jewel box, or this black nebula known as the coal sack. And in Aboriginal mythology, this is the head of a dark emu that spans the length of the galaxy. We are blessed in the southern sky in Australia to see this in dark sky. Vijayan knew this was the beauty in the night sky over Singapore, and he could see in a way and peer through obscurity at lights which illuminated his mind and demonstrated that faith and commitment to his fellow humans. So I'll close. It has been a privilege in the journey of life to have met and encountered somebody like Vijayan. He emphasises how contingent each of us are, and that each of us needs all of us. Vale Vijayan.
Professor Russell Gruen from Australia. He is the Dean of the Australian National University College of Health and Medicine. He's a former trauma surgeon at the Alfred in Melbourne, Professor of Surgery and Public Health at Monash University, and the Director of the National Trauma Research Institute. He established the Australian Trauma Quality Improvement Program and the Australian Trauma Registry, a Centre of Excellence in Traumatic Brain Injury, and the Australia-India Trauma System Collaboration, and wrote the history of the Victorian State Trauma System. From 2015 to 2018, he was the Vice Dean of the Lee Kong Chan School of Medicine, the Director of the Institute for Health Technologies at Nanyang Technology University in Singapore, in partnership with the Imperial College of London. Dr. Russell has a PhD in Health Service Research and postdoctorate qualifications in Health Policy, Medical Ethics and Business Management from Harvard, and is recognized globally for his work on the medical professionalism and health system advancement. He has some of the Australian's top clinician scientist awards, including the NHMRC Practitioner Fellowship, the RAC's John Mitchell Crouch Fellowship, and the General Surgeons Australian Medal. He is an elected fellow of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, the Academy of Medicine of Singapore, and the International Surgical Society, in which he is the president of the Alliance for Surgery and Anesthesia, presents its global surgery arm. Let's welcome Dr. Russell Gruen.
Thank you very much, and greetings, colleagues and friends. I join you from Canberra, which is the traditional land of the Ngunnawal Aboriginal people, and it's right that I acknowledge them. In 2015, I moved from Melbourne to Singapore to be a surgeon at Tan Tock Seng Hospital and to be Vice Dean in the new Lee Kong Chan School of Medicine. I'd previously been the director of the National Trauma Research Institute and a trauma surgeon at the Alfred. And in that role, I developed close friendships with many of you. For example, with John Crozier, we set up the Australian Trauma Registry during the period that Ian Civil was president of this Australasian Trauma Society and then the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons. Amit Gupta, Mahesh Mishra and I created the Australian-India Trauma System Collaboration. And I met on many occasions with Narain, Ted Herbosa, Vijayan, Ming Turk and many others through various ATLS, DSTC, NMTC and trauma quality improvement activities across the region. I was excited to visit Singapore several times before my family and I finally moved there. And on those visits, I met with Vijayan, with Ming Turk and Karen Goh, planning the wonderful things that we would do together in trauma, in surgery, and because I'm a bass player and I recognized that Vijayan was a drummer, in the music that we'd make after the theatre lists were finished. I'll never forget his big smile as we compared song lists and favourite musicians. We had plans to rock. But when I arrived in Singapore, Vijayan was no longer there, or at least his physical presence was absent. The huge space he left in the department was palpable, and all were still in shock. In the end, I had a wonderful 3.5 years in Singapore, working closely with Ming Turk and with Karen, and I've forever been grateful to them for their leadership and the entire Tan Tock Seng surgical and trauma team, especially Wei Chong and Li Tsung, for making me feel so welcome. Ming Turk was every bit as talented on the piano as Vijayan was on drums, but sadly, he had much less need for a struggling bass player like me. In my role as Dean of the Australian National University, I still remain indebted to and committed to supporting all my friends and colleagues across Asia who've been my friends and soulmates. I'm so happy to be with you again today. Now, one of those soulmates is Ted Herbosa, who generously showed me around his hospital in Manila back in 2013, and we enjoyed much time together at the WHO and on the Trauma Care Checklist project team. He is a giant in the field of trauma surgery and disaster management, and he today gave a presentation that would have been close to Vijayan's heart, disaster management being a particular interest of his. Ted's presentation gives you both the nuts and bolts of disaster management, triage, and so on, and the tips and tricks you would get from someone with vast experience. And he also gave you the gems that you only get from someone at the top of his game who has much wisdom to offer. In describing his philosophy of disaster management, Ted called it a combination of the right treatment for the right person at the right time, which is the fundamental of a good trauma system, and the maximum benefit for the maximum number, which is a fundamental of public health. And so Ted's presentation made me wonder, as we all navigate through the public health crisis of our generation, would trauma surgeons have managed the global pandemic differently? And would we be better off because of it? I'm semi-serious about this question. We've had some time to reflect on what happened and what could have been done better. I won't offer a comprehensive policy analysis, of course, but I will reflect from my own country and from observing responses around the world that public health and governments did not respond quickly enough and with enough seriousness. And the virus did escape into the community. And because the virus doesn't swim or fly across oceans by itself, island nations, such as many of ours, at least in theory, had the opportunity to keep COVID out. And those that closed their borders did, or at least they sort of did, which means they eventually didn't. And now we're living with the consequences. We could have kept the virus out and lived virus-free until vaccination had been achieved if we'd done damage control properly. Damage control is the proven approach for decision makers facing potential catastrophe. As we all know, it works when a torpedoed battleship is sinking. That's where the term was coined. And it works when a seriously injured patient is bleeding to death. I reckon it would have worked when we're facing being run over by a viral pandemic. So to naval captains and trauma surgeons, damage control has the same 3 steps. The first is rapid, decisive action aimed specifically to avert disaster. The second is a period of high-level support, thorough evaluation and expert repair. And then the third is restoration of function and return to activity. Whether at sea or in the operating theatre, the first step is time critical. If the response is too slow, the ship will take on too much water or the patient will lose too much blood and all is lost. That's the difference between ordinary day-to-day decision-making and decisions in which outcomes may be catastrophic. The door must not be left open to reaching a position from which recovery is impossible. Statistically, even if the chance on any day is only 1 in 100 of uncontrolled virus spreading leading to multiple fatalities, after 69 days, this is more likely to have occurred than not. And when it does happen, none of the previous successes matter. The COVID equivalent of this, the point from which recovery is impossible, is viral outbreak that can't be contained through social distancing and contact tracing. And in Australia, while we've done pretty well, we now have COVID. Most of the country is locked down. And I suggest the COVID response failed when we consider it through the lens of damage control in at least 3 ways. First, we dithered before closing the borders, initially thinking it wasn't so serious or we didn't really want to hurt the economy. That's like being too slow to put a finger, a tourniquet, or a clamp on a bleeding artery. Second, we relied too heavily on hotel-based quarantine for everyone entering the country when the virus leaked out from 1 in every 250 infected quarantined people. That's like a slow bleed that leads to crashing the patient back to the operating theatre in the middle of the night. And finally, while we've had some states actually eradicate COVID after outbreaks, which is an amazing achievement, we've now seen the consequence of failure to lock down in subsequent outbreaks, and we probably won't be able to recover from the current one, which seems really just like watching the patient bleed in ICU and not bringing them back to theatre quickly enough. So I can't help but reach the conclusion that if our public health leaders and government officials, most of whom had never had to manage through a crisis in their careers, if they were better versed in damage control, they would have responded differently. And in my country, just maybe we'd be in a better place now. Singapore too has done pretty well through this pandemic. I know Vijayan would have loved to have had this conversation with a big smile on his face over a good meal and a healthy serve of rock and roll. Vail Vijayan.
Our next speaker is one who is familiar to many of us, who makes it a point to come regularly to our annual Singapore Trauma Conference. He is none other than Professor Narain Chotirosniramit. He's one of the founding members of the Asian Collaboration of Trauma from 2014 to 2016. He's the Chief of Trauma and Critical Care, Department of Surgery. He's a faculty of, he works in the Faculty of Medicine in Chiengmai University in Chiengmai, Thailand. He's a member of many organizations which are familiar here, such as the Royal College of Surgeons of Thailand. He's a member of the International College of Surgeons, the American College of Surgeons, the International Association of Trauma Surgery and Intensive Care, as well as the International Society of Surgery. He's an honorary fellow of the Philippine Society for the Surgery of Trauma, and he's the National Course Director of many of the trauma courses that are essential to us, such as the Advanced Trauma Life Support, the ASSET course, and DSTC course. Dr. Narain, please.
Thank you very much for the Asian Collaboration for Trauma, especially Professor Roland de la Cruz, Dr. Shumingtak, and Professor Amit Gupta for inviting me to join this. More than 10 years ago, I met one person in a meeting in Philippines. His name is Vijayan Appasamy. I remember his face. He's a very kind doctor. He has a unique teaching style. He's a great friend for me. We have a common hobby. He has a big camera. I also have a big camera. Even his lens is bigger. My lens is smaller, but we talk a lot about the technique of photograph. So we get used to, we get close very fast because we have a common hobby together. I learned a lot from him. And he used to come to Thailand for teach, at least twice, come to the southern part of Thailand in Songkhla for teaching the STC courses. He teaches us a lot. I also learned a lot from him. And I also keep some teaching style and way of teaching that he used to teach the trauma surgeon and general surgeon in Thailand. And during his stay, and I meet him in many, many countries, Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, and many places. He teaches and he grew up so many surgeons in Thailand. Great friend, great mentor, great teacher, great photographer, singer, artist. I will remember him, and every people in Thailand that he teach, we remember him. So rest in peace, Vijay. Thank you very much. The seeds of knowledge, education that you plant in Thailand grow up now and help a lot of people, a lot of sick patients, trauma patients in Thailand, keep them survive. So for talking of Professor Ismail, thank you very much. Congratulations for your comprehensive talk and give us a lot of new knowledge from me also. Professor Ismail mentioned about the importance of low middle income country about the trauma. It's to be a very big problem and the problem that has been neglected. Yes, when we would like to take care of the trauma case, we need to do as a team approach. We cannot do it alone. Even from the pre-hospital, in the hospital, or even in the critical care area. Trauma training, Professor Ismail mentioned about the aim of trauma training for the knowledge, for the skill, attitude, communication, teamwork, and also the clinical decision making. And also, he also mentioned about the training for the people who are going to come to take care of trauma case have to be multi-modality training strategies. So simulation is going to be the answer. Because of simulation, can do it in this safety environment, repeatability, can set up the range of variety of difficulties and have also clinical variations. And you can do also in team or individual training. And the most important part is feedback. So there are many modalities for training in simulations such as role play, task trainer, simulator, patient simulator, or even you can use the mannequin electronic patients, or cadaver, or live animal. In Thailand, we cannot find out the high technology simulator. So we just use the cadaver, we use the animal, we use the patient simulations. Any kind of be used for simulations, it can help and build up the team because we need a lot of person. Even in the ER, you need to use the nurse, paramedic, people who can come to help you to build up for resuscitation. Even the big course such as the ATUS move to teach in the team more than just single doctor as the previous edition we have. So simulations, if you want to do, you build up the team and can build the team approach. Professor Ismail also mentioned about the analyze the gap and set up the objections. Design the course, which is very important, and do the simulations. After that, you have to do the debriefing and evaluation. Have the cycle of development of the course, and it's gonna be not one size fit all. It should be the tailor-made and fill the gap. So for the simulation, can teach you for the psychomotor skill, teach for the trauma decision making, and also can help for the trauma non-technical skills also. Finally, the most important part of training, any kind of training, also simulation, is the feedback. Feedback can help us for learning and continuous learning after there is some people feedback what we have done, what we did well, what we have to improve. In summary, final words is when you want to train the trauma simulation, you cannot do it alone, same as Professor Ismail is saying. Thank you very much.
Also, thank you to the organizing committee, Dr. Chiengmai. And I think, yeah, I had heard for the last 2 hours how our Professor Vijayan had affected us in our life, in our society, in our country, particularly in the field of trauma and academics. I know Professor Vijayan when I started attending the ATLS and also the DSTC way back in 2006 and 2007 in Singapore. I think that was an eye-opener, although that my interest was trauma, but I think this is where I see a man with a passion in trauma. His commitments toward the trauma, I think giving a class to us directly during the lectures, during the exams, and even the tutorial, and eventually during the simulation had shown that I think he is a very, very, very committed person. And I think his commitments not only confined to his own country, yeah, extend beyond international in Malaysia. I think we had worked together, our universities had signed a memorandum of understanding with Tan Tock Seng Hospital, and eventually that's where our close communications and relationship was with Prof. Vijayan when he came regularly for courses and also for advice. And I think eventually it spread up to our trauma community, especially in our group at Johor counterpart led by Dr. Rizal. And until now, I think Dr. Rizal has led a very good team and had spearhead the Malaysia trauma programs for the surgeon, especially in the country. Congratulations to Rizal. I think you also acknowledge Vijayan commitments and contributions towards this development. And I think with regard to the Asian collaboration of trauma, if I remember well, I think when we were in Bacolod, Cebu, when we received an invitation by Ted and the friends over there, I think a few of us, Ismail, Chiengmai, Vijayan, were there. I think it took us 2 flights to reach Cebu, and I think that was a very interesting flight because we had a lot of time to talk, we had a lot of time to discuss, and eventually, I think this is where the Asian collaboration of trauma started and initiated from the 3 countries, and now I think we're expanded beyond Asia Pacific. I think there's a very tremendous contributions, particularly from Vijayan, where I think when we discussed earlier, we were thinking how to disseminate trauma among the Asians. How are we going to organize this, having it like through a formal association or just quorums for discussion among the academics. But eventually, I think now we have showed that the testimonial, how the Asian collaboration of trauma had developed and progressed and cherished into one big community among the trauma physicians, trauma surgeons among Asia Pacific. And I think I'm glad that I'm part of that contributors. And I think another important platforms through this, I think this is where all those with passion in trauma are able to be together and then develop standardization of trauma through certain programs like the STC, ATLS, BEST, and I think that's a standard things that we are talking, and then how we disseminate our training. With regards to the presentation by Dr. Chiengmai, I don't think I'm in a position to give any feedback at all. I think no one else deserves to deliver the tribute to Prof. Vijayan except his close friend, his host partner, and no one else except for Dr. Chiengmai. I think your presentation, which included the trainees, the members that had worked together with Prof. Vijayan's, the families, I think the daughters and the wife had shown clearly this man, Professor Vijayan, is a man with true spirit. He loved trauma, and I think he committed to disseminating trauma as his passion, and until now, this is the evidence of his fruitful contributions to trauma. And sure enough, I think through what Dr. Chiengmai had presented, his personal life has also been explored, being an avid photographer, an avid stargazer, and I hope that his soul rests in the stargazing heaven there, and looking at my reactions on Dr. Chiengmai with